let's talk about the complete tales of HP Lovecraft, Lovecraft in general, because this is virtually all of his fiction in this edition. This is the Rock Point edition. It's kind of got a very nice cover with a relief art style with this Cthulhu thing, and then a gilt edge to the cover, not to the book itself, and a bookmark. This is the one I got because I like single editions where I can get them. This has virtually all of his stuff in it. It missed a couple of short pieces, but basically Lovecraft, everything he published during his lifetime went into the amateur press. There are some debates and confusions about copyright and about who held rights for different things at his death, but the main copyrights are with his aunt, who didn't renew it. So essentially it all very quickly went into the public domain, yeah, so it's easy enough to get, but I like this edition. Lovecraft is a weird fiction writer. Weird fiction sounds like a descriptor rather than a genre, like that's weird fiction. But we use it, I guess, to mean a sort of slightly vague crossover of different genres. Science fiction very often, but not always. Horror, sometimes touching on ghost story, sometimes touching on fantasy. Other important weird fiction writers would be Robert Chambers or Clark Ashton Smith. Robert Howard, the great friend of H.P. Lovecraft, great pen pal, who wrote Conan, touches on it, flirts with it. He never goes very deep into it, but I'll get to this, but he definitely does go into that. Nowadays, you might look at people like, they mention, your Clive Barkers, your Stephen Kings, Chona Mieville. Mieville is the one who people use weird fiction as a genre descriptor of most, I think, now. Barker and King, of course, you might think of as horror, and I think that's important that we recognise that horror develops out of this weird melange. Abraham Merritt is actually another old writer a sci-fi writer who touches on weird fiction, actually, as well. I've reviewed him on the channel. But we might think, oh, so it's horror. King and Barker, they are horror writers. But it's more complicated than that, because there is a different mix of things going into it, and the genres evolve and change and shift, I think. And obviously, any genre is only an approximation. But yes, he writes this interesting mix of something that has a sci-fi base with real big existential horror themes, but also sometimes stuff that touches on, is pretty clearly touching on the fantasy genre as well in terms of the mechanics involved. Like, call it the magic or the science. And in that sense, it's just its own thing, particularly because basically everything he wrote, not literally everything, I guess, but virtually everything he wrote is in one literary universe. It's shared, and that means that the sci-fi stuff is shared with the slightly odder philosophical and fantasy stuff, and so it's all part of the same mix. And the big aim for him, and he does talk about this, both in non-fiction, on writing, it's not on writing horror stories, on writing something fiction, and on a long essay he wrote, and in a couple of the short stories as well, dealing with the deep horrors we have about that which we don't understand, can't control. It all linked into his big personal philosophy of Cosmism, this thing where humans were essentially irrelevant and meaningless in the grand scheme of things. Everything was so far beyond our understanding and control. So that's an overview of Lovecraft. He wrote a lot of stuff, but not as anywhere near as much as, say, Howard or many other writers. This is, I think, the fiction in this takes up 1,075 pages of pretty ordinary size and layout and stuff. There are, I guess, the final thing to say in terms of what he wrote, and then I'll move on to some pros and cons, I guess, is, as well as a few small things, a few almost straight horror stories, a couple of pieces of, one piece of humour, and some other kind of oddities on the edge of genres. Really, he wrote two main cycles of stories, which heavily interlink. One being the main sort of his, call it the Cthulhu stories. They're mostly nothing to do with Cthulhu, but the weird space aliens, star god, unknowable horrors cycle of stuff, which goes back as early as the very early story Dagon, which was, I think, his fourth story that he wrote, through something like the Nameless City, which technically is actually a Conan link into Lurking Fear, Rats in the Wall, all the way forward to the famous stuff Call of Cthulhu and Colour Out of Space, Dunwich Horror, Whisper in Darkness, Mountains of Madness, Shadow over Innsmouth, Dreams in the Witch House, all those big unknowable horrors, witches, space and time, bending, time travel, things like that. The other set of stories are the Dreamlands stories, where basically the most common form of Dreamland story involves a mortal dreamer, and not always this, but this is the most common important form. A mortal dreamer, intentionally or perhaps accidentally even sometimes, accesses the Dreamlands, a parallel universe, essentially a different dimensional space, partly formed by our dreams, partly by other things. And these are the same universe. So all this Star God stuff, and indeed when he goes back in time to the Conan, connects to the Conan stuff, to when he's talking about, we're in our dreams and all this crazy stuff's happening. That's all the same world, and he ties it together via both his actual philosophy and a sort of fictionalized meta-science of this. And there are different things going on in each of those types of story. And the main types of story, the Dreamland story, tends to be a lot odder and angular, often much more adventure-like, and not always. Sometimes it has features of other types of things he writes, but in that kind of area, whereas the cosmic horror, Cthulhu stuff is really... I'm finding out secrets man was not meant to know, and this is the story of how I did it, and this is the horrible stuff I discovered. The Dreamland stuff does get that too, but there is a different feel to each. His single greatest strength. It'd be easy to say, he writes creepy stories, that's his single greatest strength, but I think that's a result of a few other factors. His single greatest strength as a writer is an endless invention for atmospheric strange things. Here's another atmospheric strange thing. They often share elements, particularly the idea of slightly decayed New England locales. But yeah, basically, the fact he's just got like, here's another place, here's another weird setup, here's another way this has come about, here's another rather creepy and unpleasant denouement to this mystery about what's happening, the things that they've discovered. And that certainly comes out in the Dreamlands too. Here's just another weird thing. Here's another strange kind of fantasy element almost, and the Dreamlands are his fantasy in that sense compared to the Cthulhu sci-fi. So he's endlessly inventive, and he also is very good at creating atmosphere. As I say, he creates atmospheric situations, and that means he has to learn to write atmosphere. He is a very dense writer, and I'll come back to this in different ways later, but who piles stuff up, he has lots of impressions. He's very good at observing. He obviously had a strange eye in real life. He just observes the strange and unpleasant elements of life very well, of people around him, of locations, and certainly of social, what he viewed at least as social, architectural, etc. decay. And so you're drawn into this. This is a strange, unpleasant place. I don't like it. They all feel uncomfortable, and I'm getting that feeling too, because, and sometimes, he's quite blunt instrument about it, but other times he's quite careful and subtle, and even the blunt instrument sometimes works. You get hit on the head with a club, you fall unconscious. So there's all these stories, all these strange, inventive stories, new situation, and it's all very atmospheric, and at his best, he also is very good at structuring a story so that the punchline, essentially, because these are horror stories, and in that sense, many of them, not all of them. I'm really talking more about the cosmic horror cycle than the Dreamlands. Sometimes the Dreamlands want to have this too, but the horror cycle, the cosmic horror stuff, tends to have a punchline, And then I discovered this, or this weird thing happened at the end, and very often he pulls that off very, very well. Even when you're kind of half worried he's not going to pull it off, like it's not wholly working, and then just about he squeaks through with this sense of this very strange thing that either you've seen or you haven't seen or whatever. He doesn't rely generally on insane, intense surprise, and I the sort of thing where I don't know, it's Bruce Willis in The Sixth Sense kind of thing. It's not something where you are necessarily going to be shocked and amazed by the weird conclusion. You might be. There are some interesting conclusions, but I think very often you're going to be like, oh no, this is going to happen. Oh dear, is this? Is that the case? Oh no. And I think that's fine that it's not surprising, but that there sometimes can be a way in which you have an emerging realization with the character of how horrible things are. Why would you bother with this? I think there's something very cathartic in it. We do all have existential horror at some level, I guess. I think it's inevitable with age, if nothing else. And I think that, this is just your basic Aristotle, isn't it? I think it's not that therefore we enjoy feeling miserable, but rather having things externalized removes them from us. And I think he's very good, and that must have been part of why his writing was dealing with some of his own demons. So yeah, that's very strong. I'd also say there are times where his writing is good in certain ways anyway, but I wouldn't say generally I'm like, oh yes, he's not Tolkien. But there are moments where you find him writing at a pitch which most popular writers never do. They're good writers, they have really nice bits, but they never hit a moment of sublimity. And I think in that sense, it's worth just saying some bits of his writing, every couple of stories you'll find just an incredible description, something horrendous, something interesting. But I'm actually going to read this, but in one case, something where, and it's virtually unique in his work, but all the more reason to share it. He just writes something beautiful and moving. For know you that your golden marble city of wonder is only the sum of what you have seen and loved in youth. It is the glory of Boston's hillside roofs and western windows aflame with sunset, of the flower fragrant common and the great dome on the hill, and the tangle of gables and chimneys in the violet valley where the many-bridged Charles flows drowsily. These things you saw when your nurse first wheeled you out in the springtime, and they will be the last things you will ever see with eyes of memory and of love. And there is antique Salem with its brooding years, and spectral Marblehead scaling its rocky precipices into past centuries, and the glory of Salem's towers and spires seen afar from Marblehead's pastures across the harbour against the setting sun. There is Providence, quaint and lordly on its 7 hills over the blue harbour, with terraces of green leading up to steeples and citadels of living antiquity, and Newport climbing wraith-like from its dreaming breakwater. Arkham is there with its moss-grown gambrel roofs, and the rocky rolling meadows behind it, and antediluvian Kingsport hoary with stacked chimneys, and deserted quays and overhanging gables, and the marvel of high cliffs and the milky misted ocean with tolling buoys behind. Cool vales in Concord, cobbled lanes in Portsmouth, twilight bends of rustic New Hampshire roads where giant elms half hide white farmhouse walls and creaking well sweeps. Gloucester's salt wharves and Truro's windy willows. Vistas of distant steepled towns and hills beyond hills along the north shore, hushed stony slopes and low ivied cottages in the lee of huge boulders in Rhode Island's back country. Scent of the sea, fragrance of the fields, spell of the dark wood, and joy of the orchards and garden at dawn. These are your city, for they are yourself. New England bore you, and into your soul she poured a liquid loveliness which cannot die. This loveliness, moulded, crystallized, and polished by years of memory and dreaming, is your terraced wonder of elusive sunsets. And to find that marble parapet with curious urns and carven rail, and descend at last those endless balustraded steps to the city of broad squares and prismatic fountains, you need only to turn back to the thoughts and vision of your wistful boyhood. Which is remarkable, and all the more remarkable because most often this skill of atmospheric writing that is really well executed and is really approaching sublimity is on things that horrify him. There is a great deal of angst and horror in Lovecraft, but there's also a great love for a place that haunts him, which scares him, which he sees as decayed, but which ultimately it is him. It has been they are your city, they are yourself. So yes, that's I guess some of his strengths. He's a great writer. Lovecraft is a great writer. He is an odd writer in some ways in terms of how intensely focused he is. He writes stories about intense, neurotic, unattached men, i.e. HP Lovecraft, coming a cropper of cosmic horror or having strange experiences. And that limits his appeal, but in some ways, he's obviously an incredibly popular writer, but it limits his appeal in some ways. It limits the things he does, but the things he does, he's incredibly focused on, and that's a legitimate decision. He is a great writer, but unlike many great writers, or some great writers, there are definitely things where I'd say, yes, this is a caveat with Lovecraft. There are things you've got to say about Lovecraft just to be able to cope with his writing. One thing is that his writing is dense. I've already read it. I read a very dense bit of text that really worked. He nonetheless never meets an adjective or a figure of speech that might serve without liking it. He never goes home alone without them. Just to quote, this isn't even a bad example. There are worse examples, but this struck me as a really good example of the way he structures sentences. This is one sentence, about 3 lines on this text. Then, as I playfully shook him and turned him round, I felt the strangling tendrils of a cancerous horror whose roots reached into illimitable pasts and fathomless abysms, the night that broods beyond time. The fact that is not something which happens once in a story. That is something which happens once in a paragraph. There is some, and in the paragraph there's also another sentence with like 4 adjectives. This is dense. There's just so much. He's talking so much. In a recent episode of Portal to Fantasy, I just opened at random pages and like, oh yeah, here's a bit of him describing. I'll do it here. At length we resolved to carry out our original plan of flying 500 miles eastward with all of 4 exploring planes and establishing a fresh sub-base at a point which will probably be on the smaller continental division as we mistakenly conceived it. That's an interesting one. That there are several adjectives there, and there's an adverb too. It's not actually the most baroque. He writes much more baroque ones than that. But that is an average sentence. It's long. It's over 3 lines in that case. It involves lots of adjectives. He is the opposite of terse. He is never terse. He is never clean. He never simply writes a sentence that he has trimmed down and made spare. He is the opposite of Cormac McCarthy or someone like that. And sometimes, if we're honest, at least in my case, I'm sure other people will agree, I've talked about it with some people, is I read it and I'm like, man, I'm enjoying this. I am finding it hard to stay focused just a little bit. I'm keeping going because the word counts, though he writes mostly short stories, the word counts are relatively high in a story compared to the amount of information conveyed. Because he's an atmospheric writer who's attempting to pile up the words to drown you in the atmosphere. It means sometimes you really do drown. It's worth observing, because this is certainly something that will cross some people's mind. Lovecraft has issues with race, pretty obviously. He obsesses at points about... a big thing is he believes... this is an interesting parallel to Howard, because he has similar but different views to Howard. Howard thought peoples as a whole went through cycles of degradation and ascent, not quite in evolutionary terms, but in kind of cultural terms, and that wasn't necessarily racialized, but it could be, but it wasn't necessarily. Lovecraft has an obsession with essentially incest, degeneration, crossbreeding with other species that sometimes feels a lot like he's talking about miscegenation, basically, as that's something that really bothers him. And it's obviously these are some of the angsts he has, and it's not just racialized, I should be clear. Part of it is this general fear of these people are all out in the backwards and they're all inbred and they're breeding monsters. There is something, or these people in this town and they're kind of decayed and decrepit and poor. There are things where as he looks at, I guess, the Rhode Island and the Massachusetts, particularly of his time, but New England, he sees what he feels is this decayed, strange place that has lost its former glories. Has become poor, decrepit and disgusting, and he talks about that in all kinds of ways, and some of those are undoubtedly racialized very explicitly. He's subtle in that. But the one thing I'd say about the racialism involved is not necessarily that it's against one ethnicity. Do you know a guy who he doesn't often talk about it, but it's pretty clear in, say, Dreams in the Witch House, that he finds Polish people who have all immigrated to Boston, they're a problem. he once or twice talks slightingly of, well, people who are Iberian and therefore presumably Portuguese, because he's talking about people who live in New England. And, you know, it's casual, it's implicit to him. It could bother people. There's a cat with an unfortunate name. That said, there are some nuances, and also it's something which is not overwhelming. And it's interesting, in one of the stories which suffers, some would say suffers most with that, Shadow over Innsmouth, is also one of his best in terms of how well he lands the plane, something he doesn't always do. That is something else I think stylistically, content-wise, that's going to bother some people. There are occasional cases as well where just things are repetitive. Mountains of Madness, his second longest book, story, is very much there, where you realise, he's repeating this in a serialisation. I'm reading it as one. That's boring. It's never been edited in a meaningful way. Maybe the final thing is, some stories don't land. One thing he certainly does have issues occasionally landing the plane. He will sometimes decide it's time to end, and the story ends, and it doesn't mean he doesn't have the horrific ending. He does, but it's like, oh, okay, that's just happened. I see. Similarly, you could actually find how grim many of the endings are, demoralising, and you might not enjoy it. A couple of stories I'd say as well, the ones where he is more philosophical, he talks about his philosophy. I'm thinking particularly of Through the Gates of the Silver Key and The Unnameable, aren't very good. As soon as he is discoursing at length about essentially literary and cosmic theory, but in fictional prose, I think he struggles to keep it interesting, because at that point it's like reading anything else. This is a book where just half of it is a lengthy explanation of why the author is a Christian or an atheist or a vegan, whatever belief or religion or whatever else it is, that they just want to say, by the way, this is why this is all the case. Those are weaker stories, and that does come up sometimes. I think all in all, it's a triumph. It's an amazing collection. There's so much in it. There are so many different ways of thinking about the strange and unknown beyond us. Actually, X-Files isn't straight sci-fi or horror, is it? It's weird fiction. It's TV weird fiction. There's an X-Files vibe to it often in that sense. And I think the way in which Lovecraft grasps the psychology of fear and of courage as well, of courageous men who are too brave for their own good, who try to do good, in some cases genuinely are doing good as well while they get themselves into trouble, it's an important achievement, and grim but underrated. I really like both cycles. I like the cosmic horror stuff, and I like the Dreamland stuff. I would particularly recommend it if you're reading one story. Oh, one thing I should say is there are things like the fact that Lovecraft canonizes stuff from Howard, which was something him and Howard talked about, but also Clark Ashton Smith. There's also this extended world and universe of strangeness which you can read around, which is also fun, an early shared universe. I would suggest, if you're kind of thinking about going, a very good Dreamland story to read, it's only 3 pages, is The Cats of Ulthar, very famous, and will give you a pretty strong sense of what's going on in the Dreamlands cycle. The Great Dreamland Story, Strange High House in the Sky, which is 8 pages in this edition, also a very good Dreamland story to start on. And you could try The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath if you want. That's the longest Dreamlands one. That is his third longest, I think, third longest story, which is a novella or very short novel about a long quest through the Dreamlands, which ends up building in a dozen or more stories that he's already written. You hear about stuff from Celephais, The Doom That Came to Sarnath, Nyarlathotep, the Other Gods, and Azathoth. For instance, Pigman's Model comes into that. So all these stories are drawn in. The way that Randolph Carter, who's the main character, has already been built up in stories of his, not all of which are. The first Randolph Carter story, for instance, isn't Dreamlands. It's a cosmic-y horror one. So that's the big Dreamlands one. if you're wanting the cosmic horror stuff, I think a good short one to go for is probably, let's have a think, because yeah, you want something that's short enough and rich enough and doesn't have those kinds of issues of oddity. I think, yeah, The Lurking Fear is a medium length one for him. It's 19 pages, which is a good early example of that horror-y feel. Rats in the Walls as well. Both of them have issues with landing. There's something where they're not his very best landings, but Rats in the Wall is 17 pages. Call of Cthulhu, 19 pages, actually. Maybe that's a good place to start. Very famous one, of course. Cthulhu comes up at many points, but the one that most talks about the cult of Cthulhu and things. Slightly longer, Colour Out of Space, 25 pages. Genuinely a great story. Shadow over Innsmouth, 58 pages in my edition. Dreams in the Witch House, 33. And then the two long ones, his second longest, and this is the one I'd recommend as a long one, with caveats, is At the Mountains of Madness. Very famous one as well, with an expedition to Antarctica, which gets increasingly strange. There is an interesting thing which comes up in some of those that I've mentioned, by the way, where you realise the cosmic horror is layered, and he shows deep sympathy for these weird things that you find out there that aren't the weirdest things. So, yeah, I've given you a selection that in both Dreamlands and that, which I think deal with his non-human species and the way in which he shows a surprising sympathy for them. But yes, so that's a decent selection of the cosmic horror stuff as well that I think you could, you would read and enjoy if you're going to enjoy it at all. I think Lovecraft is a great writer. I think there are caveats on him. There are caveats on him which are worth making because he is so stylistically rich and has a few weird quirks that I think some people are going to really bounce off that. But with those caveats in mind, I think if you want to understand not just, where has weird fiction come from? Where has horror come from? Where has modern cosmic sci-fi stuff come from? But also, if you want to, I want to understand D&D's influences. But also, if you just want probably the single best expositor of the creepy, weird story, without the kind of moral fibre of the ghost story, without the deep fear and scare of the horror, the straight horror, but just this high point of existential discomfort in the face of things you don't understand. I think Lovecraft is your best expositor for that. Tell me your favourite Lovecraft stories. Tell me what you like and dislike about him in the comments, and I'd love to hear that, particularly your recommendations for good stories to start reading Lovecraft with. Till next time.